They didn't just violate the law, they violated our conscience. And at that point, we had an obligation to not follow the orders that violated our conscience. Most of us had kind of been trusting, everybody's out there with good intentions, right? Like, there's a lot of people that aren't. And oh, by the way, your government is not your friend.
It's so wild looking back at all of these absurdities. Every single officer in the military who enforced this should feel deep shame at what they did because it's so preposterous.
I just want to say I'm proud of you for what you did and everything in the past and what you're continuing to do to advocate for others and fight this from a pretty high level.
I've actually listened to every single one of your episodes. To everybody out there listening, these guys are paving the way. Stay tuned to what they're doing. Follow them wherever you can follow them. God bless you for your efforts, and thank you for having me on.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon over there where y'all are both at. We've got a special guest today. I'm really excited to bring Rob Green on the studio. He's a Navy commander. He's sort of the George Washington of our fight against the DoD, but at least on the Navy side. I know there's a couple of others that are really in the fight, but Rob literally wrote the book on the mandate fight. It's this book right here called Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines, a story of hope for those who love liberty. We're going to put that in the show notes. We're going to have a link to that in our newsletter. Everybody needs to go buy this book. This walks through what happened, kind of some background of how we got to the point where we were at, which led to the three of us meeting originally in the group that we met in the mandate resistance. And so Rob is a Navy surface warfare officer. He was the the executive officer of a maritime security squadron. And we'll start from the beginning. We'll go into as much detail as you want, but basically at a certain point, you were prohibited from entering the building that you worked in. You were sitting in your car in the snow and sailors had to come out and bring paperwork for you to sign as the XO, because all of a sudden, after 2 years of there being no, quote, COVID tests, which weren't real anyways, and you being just fine without taking them, now they became a product and mandated. And all of a sudden, we flip on a switch and now you have to take them. And because you weren't taking them, because you had the right not to take them, and we'll get into all that, you had to stay in the parking lot. Absolute absurdity, absolute cowardice. I'm going to sum it up with one line that is like the thesis of this book. The unlawful policies of the Navy, the inability of leaders to think for themselves, and the lack of moral courage required of leaders to stand up for their subordinates' rights were responsible for my being unable to enter my own workspaces to do my job. This is when your commanding officer told you that your decisions are causing you to sit in the parking lot. And obviously, no, they weren't. It's preposterous. So welcome to the show. We're going to talk to you about your book, talk to you about your situation with the mandate in the Navy, and then we're going to get into IBC because you are now a client. You're practicing family banking. So we want to hear what appealed to you about IBC, how you heard about it, the process, and what you plan to do with your family bank going forward. So Rob, welcome.
Thank you both for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you guys. I've been following your work very closely. I've actually listened to every single one of your episodes because this stuff gets me so excited. Now, I'm a big podcast consumer. I do that while I'm driving, and you put it on fast speed and get through a lot. But y'all's is one that I save for the long car trip so I can focus because I love this stuff and really exciting for me. And following y'all's work, your own transition through what we went through together as part of the COVID fight, it's like having brothers from the foxhole moving on to bigger and better things. And so, I'm still kind of stuck in the Navy and grateful to see you guys making this, part of your life, that's not part of, government service, making it something that's really helping people. It's great for me. So God bless you for your efforts and thank you for having me on.
It's awesome. I was just thinking, it's wild. I reread your book in its entirety yesterday. I was sitting in airports, so I'd read it when it first came out. What year was that? Was that 22?
July 4th, 2023.
July 4th, 2023. Okay, I remember it was like in the midst of it, and we were kind of like coming out of the darkness of the meat of everything that had happened. But yeah, so I reread it just to kind of get fresh on it, man. And it's wild because the more you kind of step away and we're doing all this other business, the more you kind of, starts to fall behind a little bit. And the busier you get. And it's just like, this was like reinvigorating because I hadn't touched it in 2 years or like thought about some of this stuff. And then some of it falls behind and you don't even remember Oh yeah, that ridiculous thing happened. And like, I actually want to, before we even start, since Hans led off with this, and it's detailed in the book, so you've got to read the part where he talks about being in his car in the snow, sailors coming out to talk to you. And if somebody just listening to this that doesn't understand, somebody that wasn't part of our battle, that doesn't understand the whole fight, might say like, why didn't he just take the test? And it's detailed in this book, but can you explain real quick why you wouldn't take a test that forced them to remove you? That didn't force them, that they illegally or put you out in your car, wouldn't let you come into the building on false premise.
Yeah, so it's important to go back in time and remember what happened. So, when this went down, when everything started getting a little crazy, we'd already been going through COVID for almost 2 years, right? We saw the lack of bodies in the streets, to be, blunt about it. And we saw what happened for the people who decided not to take the government's one size fits all solution to this supposed problem. And what happened was they weaponized various, health mitigation protocols against the people that wouldn't go along with what they thought was the best solution. So there was no analysis of who was most at risk. There was no comorbidity components to who had to take their solutions. And so, we had gotten through 2020, and I was leading our detachment of 650 people through all of 2020 and all of 2022. And we did not have a single case of exposure from the virus that actually, that originated at any of our trainings, at any of our events, at any of our meetings. I followed every lawful order I possibly could. Like I couldn't find anything wrong with them saying you guys got to stand 6 feet apart, right? We have things like formations, and you're trained to 2 feet apart. Just stick your arm out, and make sure that you're not too close to the person in front of you. Like it's not a big deal. So they said, hey, make it 6, like whatever. It doesn't seem unlawful to me. But when they started saying, hey, you've got to take this test, and oh, by the way, the test is emergency use authorized product, meaning that the government has no authority to mandate it because it's an emergency thing. You always have the right to refuse. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. I've never had a symptom for COVID. I had already gone and gotten a T cell test to make sure that I had antibodies to the COVID virus. And so none of it made sense. I had no symptoms. There's like, it doesn't, like at that point, we're talking about them trying to force something on me that, one, violated my rights under the law. I have a right to refuse it. And two, made no common sense. So I responded. I said, hey, I would take your test if I had symptoms. That's the only condition in which I would be willing to accept this, right? Otherwise, I have a right to reject because it's not a fully authorized product, the test kits.
And did they
And
inform you of that right when they ordered you to take the test?
no, I had to make the doc who came and said, oh, the captain says you have to do this. Like, okay, go get the test kit box. Let's look at it. What does it say right there? Emergency use. Oh, okay. It cites a law. Let's pull up the law. And so we actually read through it and, took the time, tried to teach as well. And anyway, so that's the context in which ultimately my, commanding officer and the chain of command, ordered, okay, well, you have to be banned from the building, but you're not allowed to telework. That was the other very clear thing in the guidance I received was you're banned from the building, but telework is not authorized. I'm like, okay, what do you want me to do? So like they were setting me up to not show up so that they could charge me with something. So I showed up and, stood outside the door, sat in my car in my parking lot, a few feet from the building, things like that. Which unfortunate. I felt bad for the people who had to come out and, transact our unit business with me out in the car. But none of these things were choices that I made. I didn't want to go stand out in the car. At one point, I told the boss, okay, look, I'll set up a base camp tent. Like, it'll be great training because we have to do training on this stuff anyway. And they said, no, that's all, you're not allowed to do that. I'm like, okay.
And unfortunately, if somebody's doing business with you car side, whether they got in the business or in the car because it's cold or whether they stood right outside of your door, now they're violating the 6 foot thing of this untested, dangerous person that can't get into the building. So it's even worse because, as you know, I mean, as we all know, almost everybody transacts via email. The paper comes to your desk that you wet sign, but that's 10%. So it's kind of funny that they actually gave people more exposure to you by trying to set up this system that's going to cause you to fail. It's There's no sense in it whatsoever.
Yeah, well, common sense is an uncommon virtue. And I mean, don't forget that the virus is not transmissible within 6 feet unless it's more than 15 minutes, right? That's what we were told.
That's what we were told. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's so wild. It's so wild looking back at all of these absurdities that, like Brian said, we lived through them. We shook our heads at them at the time. We got angry at the time, and now it's comedy. It's pure comedy looking back. And every single commander, every single officer in the military who enforced this should feel deep shame at what they did because it's so preposterous. And I know we're going to have a bunch of special boys in the comment sections that say, well, you're in the military, you gave up your rights, they say take a shot. Now everyone, in order to, can you just elaborate a little bit on the EUA aspect of it? You have the right to informed consent. They have to let you know that you have the right to informed consent. And what does this specifically include in the US code that even permits emergency use products, including members of the armed forces, right? So there is no part of this, the masks, the tests, or the vaccines, that were ever anything but emergency use, and therefore none of them could be ordered.
Yeah, I mean, you laid it out perfectly, and that comes from Title 21, the code in U.S. law. What that's doing is it's a statutory enumeration of a fundamental principle, and that fundamental principle is higher than the statutory law. But the fundamental principle being that you have the right in your own person for your own health and safety. It's a personal right. It's not something that the government gets to control. Public health, there is no such thing. Health is an individual right. It's a right that's protected by the Constitution, and you have, the obligation to stand up for it. It's not the government that gets to babysit you. So there's a fundamental principle at play here too.
Yeah, the whole thing was just like you talk about in the book. No commander wanted to have a low vaccination rate or have anyone unvaccinated because they had to report that up. It's all about politics. And the ironic thing is when you cite some of the stories of people who were targeted even more so, like who actually had serious consequences, it was always the response was don't be political with this, when the entire thing had nothing to do with medicine. I'm going to read a really funny quote that, I mean, this could be in a Chris Rock skit. The Navy Surgeon General Rear Admiral Gillingham called the vaccine our biological body armor and our safest and best weapon against this unrelenting adversary. Can't even say it with a straight face now. Continuing to proselytize for the vaccine, he stated, by simply rolling up your sleeve, you can don this amazing biological body armor, make a personal contribution to community immunity, and project medical power. That's the most embarrassing thing. I would be so humiliated if I had said that. I mean, you took an approach in this book that I think is a very down the middle and fair approach. I think that for those people who believe COVID was a real pandemic that needed to be treated with tests and back, like if you believe that whole story, which I don't to any degree, you would still find this book appealing because you approached it with, hey, I want to do everything like you said, a lawful order. I will follow all lawful orders. I'm taking this seriously as they say it is, as they present it. I'll take it seriously, except you didn't deviate until it came to the unlawful order side of it. So I think that you make a great case that even if you fully believe everything you're told, you just followed the legal path when the Navy and the military deviated from the legal path. Whereas I was more just kind of burn it all down. Like nothing you're saying is true. This is not a real thing. This is all just in order to put vaccines in arms. Like the whole thing is preposterous. But I think that your book and your approach will really resonate with people. So again, everyone should go buy this book. Click the link in the notes, look in our newsletter. This is a self-published book. You have a publishing company now, and hopefully more content coming out from there.
Sorry. This book is actually published by Skyhorse. It's the same publishing company does Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s books. They did a DeSantis book, I think, recently. So, yeah, it was very blessed to get the support of both Children's Health Defense and Skyhorse for this book.
Okay, yeah, because I saw RFK was the first endorsement of this book on the back cover page here. But you do have your own publishing company now. They just didn't publish this one.
Yeah, so I did that one after the fact. I started that much more recently, but I've learned a lot about publishing and writing books and that kind of stuff, and so I want to try to give a platform to others who have stories like this to tell. So hoping to get the first book out in the next calendar year or so.
Can you walk through the denial SOP, what that was, and how that broke open a lot of the legal cases and led to the eventual end of the mandate?
The SOP is a standard operating procedure. And, as we were presenting all of this evidence, and by the way, I do take a very balanced approach here in this book because the COVID virus was real and it was a risk to a lot of people. older people, people with health problems. I mean, there were reasons for us to have caution. There were reasons for us to do, some mitigations. We should always have a mindset of trying to protect the force. I don't mind any of those principles. It's when the principles get out of order that the problems start. And so the biggest thing that was out of order was they put public health above individual health. They put, following orders above readiness. And we have all of these disordered principles at play here. So one of the things that came out of that is what you're talking about, this standard operating procedure. A bunch of, sailors, a bunch of service members from all branches like us had issues with some of these things. And some of these orders violated our conscience. They didn't just violate the law, they violated our conscience. And at that point, we had an obligation, if we're going to be truthful with ourselves and have integrity, we had an obligation to not follow the orders that violated our conscience. And so the way you inform your chain of command that you have an issue with an order that violates your conscience, you file a religious accommodation. Hey, the government has an obligation to accommodate the practice of your beliefs. And you don't even have to, be religious in the traditional sense. You can be an atheist and file a religious accommodation because you have a right to your belief system.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I knew an atheist who, I mean, actually, I don't want to tell this person's personal story, but it was one of the people that got banned from a building. Same thing. And it wasn't a person who, is traditionally religious like some of the rest of us might have been. So in the Navy, they came up with a plan to deny all of the religious accommodation requests in mass, which violates multiple, Navy regulations, Department of Defense regulations, and the law that lays out what the government's supposed to do when somebody has a religious belief that might go against a government policy. And so they're supposed to follow all these specific steps, and they're supposed to adjudicate that accommodation request and see if they can actually accommodate it or not, or whether, it meets the two criteria that would cause the government to override your beliefs, which I had issues with the way that some of the law is written. But even the way the law is written, they ignored all of those requirements. And so the Navy actually wrote a standard operating procedure for how they were to ignore the requirements, but still try to make it look like they were doing the right thing. And so one of the first steps is you took the name of the requester and then you put it on the denial template, and then you routed the template for review by all these officers, including the judge, advocate general, lawyers, the admirals that were going to deny it and all that. And only after it went through all these processes and was ready for signature does the standard operating procedure direct the person who's doing the routing and reviewing to actually open the accommodation request and start to write down, take notes on what they said so they could later try to prove that they were doing the review that was required. So it was leaked to me or given to me by an insider. And I wrote up a complaint against the admiral who under whose authority they were doing this. And then that complaint got to federal court. The Navy got the first injunction for the Navy SEALs case. And then from there, we got class-wide injunctions for the Navy, the Air Force, and then the Marine Corps. And that kind of started the big fight for us. We started clawing back some wins. And it all started with that Navy standard operating procedure. So I appreciate you asking about that.
They lay out these administrative redress paths that you can take. And there's a lot of things that plenty of us did, like an Article 138, which is command against your commanding officer. There's an Article 1150, which is complaint against a superior officer. I know, including myself, I know so many people that did the religious accommodation, Article 138, Article 1150, congressional inquiry. All of it fell on deaf ears, was just totally ignored. They were never going to approve any of these things. It was a sham. The whole thing was a charade to say we're compliant with the regulation that requires us to review these. Per federal law, we have to give each one due process. They ignored all of that. They just time-stamped it and made it look like it. And that document being leaked was so pivotal because it exposed their bad intentions. These are bad actors. And these admirals, I'm not speaking for Rob Green here. I'm not speaking for the Navy. I'm not in the Navy anymore, so I don't care. But all of these admirals, Admiral Grady, Admiral Noel, Admiral Gilday, Admiral Bays, everyone, like all these people in this book, they are bad actors that committed crimes against the people that they were supposed to lead. And they're still active. There's been zero accountability. Nothing is going to happen to these individuals. I'm pretty confident. I mean, it's basically like shook up the whole thing. And I know that they're watching you, but maybe there's an outside chance that there is accountability for those people, but honestly, I don't ever see it. And they're still in charge. Admiral Lesher is another one. They're still in charge, or they're retired and working for Lockheed. But the system moves on. All we can do is, it's kind of like, maybe this is a good point to transition towards IBC, where we recognize there's a problem with the Fed. There's a problem with this endless creation of money. There's a problem with the conventional financial planning that keeps us dependent. Well, we can't change macroeconomic policies. We don't get a vote at the Fed. And I don't get a vote as to whether or not Admiral Lesher, who denied all of these RAs without looking at them, Admiral Gilday, Admiral Grady, all these people who committed crimes, we don't get a say if there's any accountability there. So all we can do is prepare. And on the COVID, on the mandate side, that is mentally getting over it. I think is pretty much all, at least in my case. I'm out now. All I can really do is just try to mentally get over it, which is still,
And what's wild is that, there was a couple things that the rereading your book made me think back to that happened to me that were very similar to stories in your book. One is that, like, that standard operating, not only did they have their own illegal standard operating procedure, but there was no use of the chain of command from top to bottom. So, like, when you file the religious accommodation request, it goes first to your commanding officer. Commanding officer sends it up and it goes up the chain. And so I'm in the Air National Guard, so it would go, to my commanding officer, to the group officer, to the base commander, up to the state, down to the Guard Bureau, ultimately, I guess, over to the Pentagon. I don't know. They seem to just get held in the Guard Bureau waiting for resolution because there were so many thousands of them. So we had a little bit of a different result there because nobody in the Guard was denied. They kind of just sat in limbo waiting to see what active duty was going to do and how this was going to fall out. But what I did get some inside information, and I've never told this story in this kind of environment because I didn't want to throw a person under the bus, but one of the people in my chain of command approved my religious accommodation request on their end. And he said, and the argument was that I'm not deployable all of a sudden if I don't have the shot. So he says, but you're an instructor pilot, you're an evaluator pilot. Like, it takes 15 years to replace your experience level. I can use you right here if you're not deployable to keep training, to keep evaluating, to be useful in the building and in the unit. Like, so he gave me an approval. It went up to the state and it came back just like you talk about in your book. They gave him the verbiage of what to write. And I ended up seeing that through some channels. And I never wanted to talk about that, but I got a hold of that document. And to this guy's credit, I'm not going to name him, but he took their verbiage, changed it, and approved it again. I mean, it was not well received by his chain of command that he was approving this. He was expected to deny it all the way up with the words they wanted. It was wild how everything was just controlled from the top down. There's no authority for even a lieutenant colonel, or an 05 all the way up who was in command. It was wild. And the other funny thing that I got the book, Hans, that you were talking about was this, it was just dismissed, was when you talked about Captain Brennan Graves. And they go through all of this stuff, and then it's like the day after it's denied, he says, let's get you back flying. Let's get you back on the bench. Like,
yeah, after the mandate went away.
Do you have any idea what just happened for the last 2 years? Like, it's almost like everybody else who took the shot and was willing to dismiss you was just oblivious to the fact that your life was a living hell for 2 years. I experienced something similar. I remember somebody came up to me like 2 days later and he was just like, I mean, that's over now. So you're good, right? And I was like, no, I'm pissed. What do you mean I'm good? Do you realize, like, I almost lost my livelihood? How am I going to feed my 4 kids? Like, all this stress and all this pressure. And I read more law and I read more medical literature than I ever thought I would in my life. I spent all this time stressed, not spending time with my kids because I'm down in my office reading for 4 hours a night, things I don't want to read or learn about, naturally, that I'm not inclined to be interested in. No, it's not just like, oh, well, you're good now, right? So what a crazy world, and the way that the superior officers treated that. Well, it's behind you. Forget it. Let's just walk away from that and pretend it never happened.
Yeah, there's a funny meme about that, and it's like, hey, they're burning the supposed witch at the stake, right? And then the guys are like, we all made mistakes.
Yeah.
Like, so that's what they want to do. So we're at a point now in America where we need to rebuild trust, and I think you're going to have to do that with accountability. And I do want to say one thing, like, bad actors, I agree, but I don't want to make an inference about any individual's intent. The issue again is that they have disordered priorities or disordered principles. They're literally out of order. So, they might be thinking, hey, I want to protect the force. I'm told this is super bad. I believe my chain of command. I'm going to execute, and I've been given this set of orders, right? And so their intent may not be evil, but they had an obligation to the Constitution. The Constitution is designed to restrict the government, and it places primacy on individual rights. And so they completely, you know, swapped what they actually swore an oath to, and it was all about government control and tyranny. And so, that's the 60,000-foot view over what happened. And so, at this point, yes, we need some people held accountable so it never happens again. But, I'm happy if no one ever is going to hold anyone accountable. It's not going to stop me from looking to the future on how else to secure independence from my family for all of this, and how we're going to, reestablish kind of this primacy of individual rights in the circles that we do have influence over. And so that's why we do, conversations like this. It's why we educate people. It's why we want to help everybody get their principle, back into proper order so that something like this can never happen again.
Do you think there are any particular like action steps to start to take remedy for that misprioritization of what's important that those people had? Like how do we, if there is no accountability, number one, I 100% agree with that. But if that never comes to fruition, how do you train up? Like, what's the remedy going forward to make sure it doesn't happen again? To make sure that people are held accountable as it happens, before it happens, not even for what's happened in the past, but going forward, or so people actually understand and put things in their proper order.
I mean, it's education. I mean, it's what you guys are doing with your platform that you're building out. It's what I've been doing with the book. I'm working on a second book right now. I'm expanding my approach to the world that I wrote this very narrow. I mean, this is a very small problem. It's the DoD specific, just the COVID fight. There's so many other problems in the Department of Defense that I don't touch in the book. There's DEI stuff. It's lack of meritocracy, the Afghanistan withdrawal, a 20-year war on false premises where 7,000 of our brothers and sisters died. There are some really big fish to fry that we've got to fix all of this. And the new administration has committed to having some accountability for all of it. So I'm hopeful. And, there's a group of us that have proposed through various channels what those accountability measures could look like, including grade determinations. And for your audience, if they don't know what a grade determination is, if you go back and you review the actions of a past admiral or general, or any member of the armed services, really. But for our case, for these things that we just mentioned, you would review their actions and then determine the rank at which they last honorably served, and then you just unilaterally demote them to that rank. Their pay reverts to that rank, their rights and privileges revert to that rank, and that is a great way to start because it requires no judicial process. There's no rules of evidence. You don't have to have a preponderance of the evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt. It's literally the person with the authority. That's the President of the United States for, I think, 3 and 4 stars, and it's the Secretary of Defense for 1 and 2 stars. They literally just say, hey, I'm going to review your record, and then I'm making a determination. And it's done. It would be the most simple thing to get started on having some accountability for this. And I think that would be a deterrence
Oh yeah.
for future admirals and generals just willy-nilly going with whatever they're told to do without doing their due diligence.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. And I know, like historically, when that happens, you tend to see somebody makes a big mistake as like a 4-star, and they get a grade determination of 3-star. But it'd be wonderful to see some of those folks get dropped to, field grade officer. Going from 4th star to 3-star, 010 to 09 is kind of, it's a hit. It's a hit on the ego. It's a small hit on the wallet, but it's not going to deter other officers from taking the same actions that guy or lady took. But seeing somebody cut 5 ranks is a lifestyle change. And talk about not wanting to crawl out of the shadows because your ego is just on the floor. Like that would be a massive and strong deterrent.
I agree. I mean, the current acting chief of naval operations, Admiral Kilby, he's now a 4-star. He was a 3-star at the time of the writing of the book and the actions that he took there. He issued what I think I demonstrated. It's a demonstrably unlawful order, and and I filed complaints about that, which were summarily dismissed without review. And if there was a grade determination, on his actions at some point in the future, just for COVID, not necessarily for anything else. I think, there's likely other things, but just for COVID, it would be at least a 2-star.
Well, we now have the Secretary of Defense. This was huge, and shout out to Jordan Carr. She's been a pit bull on this, helping you and a small group of others kind of keep moving the ball down the field. But we now have a written and verbal admission by the Secretary of Defense that this was an unlawful order, right? So that's going to hopefully. I always try to. I mean, there's like, I'm so over it. I think there's going to be nothing coming of it, but then you guys keep moving the ball, and so hopefully there's just opens the floodgates for litigation. And maybe part of this accountability, maybe it just comes in the fact that the Navy gets blanked again in court because of the admission that it was an unlawful order. And maybe that scares people enough in the future that, hey, I'm not just going to be able to get away with this saying I was following a lawful order. And I'm not just going to be able to push something without thoroughly vetting it. Maybe the removal of the head of the JAG Corps that someone on this call may or may not have been instrumental towards is going to, cause JAGs to review and really think about, like, let's always refer back to COVID and what we did wrong and how the fallout happened. That could be another step towards accountability. But so let's transition from the mandate and how we kind of talk about our, like, the medical paradigm, our view of the DoD, our view of the government kind of just shattering all at once in 2020. And then realizing, for Brian and I, the financial industry, and he had been, he had known about IBC before that. But for me, like that allowed me, that kind of set the stage to where I was willing to receive and reconsider what I'd always thought about finance, because kind of like, you don't question an order. I grew up, you don't, the CFP model, the Dave Ramsey strategy, like that is what you do. That is how you get wealthy. You pay for everything in cash, and you eat rice and beans, and you buy high fee mutual funds. Like that's the road to wealth. Well, pre-COVID, I think if Brian had this conversation with me, it already kind of fell on deaf ears initially. It took me some time to kind of get there, but I think I would have never even reconsidered it had I not kind of had the scales fall from my eyes through COVID. So how did you come about to making the mental flip? Because it's a drastic paradigm change. It's not just like, oh, let me add another asset to my portfolio. Like, it's not that. It's totally rethinking how you interact and think about capital. We have been working with you and talking with you. So, but how did your transition go from one paradigm to another on the financial front?
No, I appreciate that. I'm going to answer your question in 3 parts, so bear with me. I'll make it really quick.
Go long if you want.
Yeah, fundamentally, it's about risk. I've always been a pretty risk-adverse person, trying to find ways to help my own, personal finances, help my own family's future. Shoot, I have like $3,000, $4,000 worth of freeze-dried food in my house, right? Like I'm very risk-averse, and I like to find mitigations wherever I can. The second part, so we can explain more on that as we go forward, but the second part of this 3-part answer, I want to tie back into risk back from COVID, from the COVID fight. I think it woke us up to what our government will do. Most of us had kind of been trusting, everybody's out there with good intentions, right? We all want to do what's best and what's right. Like, there's a lot of people that aren't. And oh, by the way, your government is not your friend. They and our founding fathers understood this, and at some point over the last 250 years, we had forgotten, that the Constitution was meant to restrict them because they saw it as the greatest danger to our future, to their prodigy. And so, it's all about risk. And in the COVID fight, oh, by the way, you mentioned Jordan Carr, and I'm really grateful you did. It was a risk decision for the Secretary of Defense to come out and make that determination that was unlawful, both verbally and in writing. You know why? It's because he is a named defendant in ongoing lawsuits because he's now in the position of Secretary of Defense. So he either has to fight in court on behalf of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's positions, or he can, distance himself from that and say, hey, I'm going to do the right thing by this. And so, he chose to take the Department of Defense in a different direction and, basically distance himself from the previous administration's actions. So it was a complete risk decision. I mean, we're all making these risk decisions as best we can. And oh, by the way, I also have to do a shout out to Casey Dixon, who is a huge part of that. Davis Yonsu is a huge part of that. These people, they're doing powerful work. And how we're going to gain traction on all of this, including, what we're about to get into, is by continuing to educate everybody, right? We're not going to let this go. So this brings us to the third part of my answer, is that we're going to have to continue to educate ourselves and everybody else that we can possibly educate on all of these fundamental things that give us back our liberty. And it can be in finance, it can be in our own personal health. There's a lot of ways that we can gain this into our food system. I love some of the podcasts that you guys have been doing with dairy farmers and, people who produce meat and things like that. Like, this independence, this individualism is a American principle that we need to get back to. And I think it's really powerful. So hopefully we brought it full circle again, but I did want to tie in. Like, for me, it was kind of all about risk and how I get control back for myself and for my family, away from the government that obviously has its own agenda, and it's not in my best interest.
Ever.
Yeah, the personal autonomy aspect of it, and understanding that we're not here to rely on experts. If we're going to rely on experts, we're going to get average. And we look around health wise, financially, if you want average, you know exactly where to go. That is the path of least resistance, is to get average financial advice and get average food and all of that. So the more we can take back control of our sovereignty. The way I saw the COVID fight was, it's such a clear message, like a clear sign from God that the path you were on is not the path that I want you on anymore. And when my wife and I had that conversation of, like, if we do this, this is it. I mean, for Navy aviation, like, you're not coming back. There's no getting back on track. This is it. We're done. Are we ready to make this decision? And it was like, it was hard, but we also knew there's no possible scenario. There's no 0% chance I'm going to take the shot. And so, but we just felt this peace about it. And then as soon as I discovered, as soon as Brian introduced me to this, and I finally came around to it and realized, and then all of a sudden we find that our mindset of thinking through becoming self-sufficient and self-educated on these things. Like, I don't trust a doctor anymore. So I don't necessarily trust my CFP inherently anymore because of a title. I need to do this myself. And it was all of a sudden, a lot of people in our group responded to that as well. And we get this business going, and it's like, I was with you the whole time. And I was actually reading my daughter a little kid's Bible last night, and we were reading about the Jews coming out of Egypt. And it's like, over and over and over, they're given a blessing, and then they start complaining, and why have you forsaken me? And then it's like, well, here's more. And then 40 years later, so it's just this constant, like, God provides and we lose the way. And I felt reading your book again got me heated again, because just, it still gets to me. But reading that to my daughter last night, I was like, this was God's plan all along. So, like, I don't need to be angry about this, because going through all of that got me to where I am right now. It's like, it's so much better. Like, this is the plan. This is the plan for me. This is where I need to be. And that we were never alone in all of this. Like, you sitting in your car, like, that was part of the plan. And if we dwell on how tough that is, that's dependency. It's so freeing to be thinking about this and being in control of your finances the same way it is to be in control of the food your family eats and medicine. And, like, you have the ability to learn this stuff on your own and become your own expert. Like, you don't even have to, don't take our word for it. All of our clients, we spend 90% of our time educating. Like, the whole thing is education. And so we want you to be self-sufficient on your own, and we'll help you get there. But this is just such a powerful concept. Sorry, I went off on a little tangent there, and, like, rereading the book just kind of reopened it, because it just got me pissed off again. But I can't live that.
I got some messages from people, after reading the book, people who were, I got one person like, yeah, I got PTSD from reading this, and I'm like, yeah, don't sue me. Like, I'm really sorry. People having to relive these things that, they're violations. They're truly violations. And so we're talking about, how to gain control back and how to reestablish principles. And you mentioned education. It's so critical. It's so important. It's why I have continued, I've used, Twitter account. I've continued to be very vocal on some of these things, pointing out where things are done wrong, congratulating people who are doing things right. And by the way, the Navy has such an issue with, my continuing to be vocal. Like, they actually did a prosecution review on me a couple months ago, trying to see what they could get me at a court martial for. It's complete weaponization. What can you do but continue to lean into the fight and try to do the right thing? So grateful that you guys are giving me the opportunity to talk about that here and dovetail into, what I'm doing with personal finances with you guys, which I'm really excited about.
Man, I just want to say I'm proud of you for continuing for what you did and everything in the past and what you're continuing to do to advocate for others and fight this from a pretty high level. So it's awesome to see, man. Took a lot of courage. I think that everybody in our space, you don't think about it in the time that it's anything courageous, but looking back, you kind of realize like, man, we're standing against a lot of fire. That was a wild time. I came up better in every area of my life because of it, by standing on conviction.
People are forged by fire. That's what this was for us. And I'll share that this is a burden that I never really wanted. Like
Mhm.
I'm a deep introvert by nature, and I'm non-confrontational. I mean, it's my wife who's the, likes to get into the fisticuffs with people. Like she was, never mashed, stared down, the department store managers and grocery clerks, and cut down police tape around the playground that kept putting up. She would keep cutting it down. I mean, that was my wife, and so that's not by nature. But what I for me, it's not. This is the burden that I would love to put down in favor of trying to educate people on stuff like this, the personal finance stuff. I shared with you guys briefly before the show, like I was so excited about what y'all are doing, partly because of the way I grew up. It was my wife that introduced me to Dave Ramsey back in my really early 20s. I might have been, 22, 23, and I fell in love with it. It was my grandfather when I was 16 who first introduced me to what investing was, showed me all his investment, taught me how to do it. And ever since then, so 16 on, I was reading about, personal finance. I was trying to learn about it. I love this stuff. And then getting introduced to Dave Ramsey, it was a whole new element. He gets so much right. And he establishes a pretty strict, a system that could kind of be a one size fits all system if you use it, if you stay in that system. And so, I fell in love with that. I used to buy Dave Ramsey books and give them away as a ministry. I used to help, sailors with building debt snowballs. I used to, analyze stock portfolios for family members and friends and help them try to do better. So during the mandate, we first met. We're in various group chats. That's how, I mean, that's, to talk about other people who've done this, even the suspendables, like Kyle Seraphin and his team, they coordinated with people they never met in person, via group chats. And that was our foxhole, really. So I used to watch the two of you go back and forth in group chats about personal finance. And you'd see, hundreds of messages in some of these groups because they got big. But those were always ones that I liked. I've penned or I saved because I love that stuff. And so ever since then, it had to have been, mid or to late 2021, maybe into 2022 when we're starting to develop those relationships in, the digital foxhole. And so it was sort of that time where my shifting started. I'm distrusting the government. I'm distrusting the medical industry. We were already not vaccinating our kids by that time. It was a slow, roll. Older kids had some, less by the middle kids. I have 7, by the way. So, it was a more of a long-term thing for us. We're not trusting the food industry, right? The commercial feeding operations they have to the cows, the way they raise chickens in some of these places, like it's, you learn about it. It's disgusting. And so, it was kind of this shift, like you were talking about at the very start of this episode. It's that shift of, well, all these things are wrong. They're all maximizing profit. They've got profit as the principle above health, individual rights, safety, all these other things. And so, what can I do in my personal sphere in my life to get those principles back in order? And for finance, when I discovered, the infinite banking concept through you guys, through the two of you, and you're teaching Hans, you brought Hans in, and you guys are now teaching everybody else. Like I fell in love with it. It had that ring of truth, and and you can combine it with other principles and other processes that help. But this is one that just it's exciting for me. It's why I became a client of you guys, and it's why I'm starting to try to educate, family members, friends, anybody who ever will listen to me, that this is a powerful tool. You can take back control. You can, start to limit your exposure to the debt system that the Federal Reserve and the monetary system that we have. This is the way to go. And so that was quite a bit long-winded, but I've even got brothers that have come on with you guys because of me sharing with them.
Shout out to
So
Matt and Luke.
yeah,
Yeah. And I'm gonna tie that back to something Hans was saying when we kind of pivoted to talking about this is like through 2021, if you didn't already have a distrust, I was like you, Rob. I have 4 kids. My first has a few vaccines. My next 3 have never had one, and they were born in 2010, 12, 14, and 19. So pre-COVID, we already walked away from the whole vaccine model. But if you hadn't come to that kind of conclusion prior to 2020, a lot of people did in 2020, 2021, and all these institutions. So you look at the medical institution, you look at the institution, the DoD, you start thinking about the food, you start thinking about the finances, and it's just like, well, what is good and what do we question? And and I think it's interesting. Have you guys read anything about Paul Atkins, the new chairman of the SEC?
I haven't.
Okay, this goes to what Hans was saying. If you trust the experts, you'll be average. Search Paul Atkins. I'll talk about just the general details. Search Paul Atkins whole life insurance. He has 54
Yeah, as I
policies.
say, he's a ton of them.
He's worth over
Wow.
$300 million. And every article you find written by, Yahoo Finance, written, I can't remember what else I read, but they were all financial, journalists, I guess, are questioning why anybody would need that much life insurance. Most Americans, like the average, I think there's 200 some million life insurance policies. Not, it's less than one per person in the United States. And they're like, the average person might have one policy. What could he possibly want to do with 54 of them? And then there's all this speculation about that. And it's like, okay, so here's this guy who's worth north of $300 million, who they find qualified to be the chairman of the SEC. He knows something about whole life insurance, but everybody that's inside the financial institution aside from him is criticizing it. It's a wild thing. So you have to start to think, and like they just can't wrap their minds around it. They're not even criticizing it on the merits of owning them. They're criticizing it because well, this isn't what most people do.
Yeah, it challenges the system, which is kind of our entire thinking and how we found this system, or how we are doing this independence, rejuvenation.
So I'm just saying the fact that this man has that many policies, and I don't know, we don't know anything about them. We don't know if they're all on him, his wife, his kids, or if he's bought policies from other people. We don't know that. It could be parents, grandkids. It doesn't matter. The fact that he has that many with that kind of wealth, that kind of knowledge, that kind of expertise, and sees the value in pumping that much money into his life insurance. And the fact that every expert is like blown away by it and thinks that it's absolutely ludicrous should tell people that are in our school of thought that are questioning all the institutions, like, why is the institution think that what he's doing is crazy? And should I find out more about that?
Well, they won't get their hands on it. That's part of the problem, right? Because he's obviously thinking generationally. And so, you're going to get that money outside the grasp of, the government, for taxes, for things like that. And, if his family going into the future keeps plugging it into policies like that, they're still, if they plug it in the right policies, follow remnant finance for how to do it, but they'll be able to access the liquidity. They'll be able to use it while they live, and they're going to leave a benefit for future generations that's just going to compound. I mean, it's so powerful, and it's how we gain some independence back while living in this system that obviously relies on, debt. I mean, it's fundamentally a problem, and we left the gold standard, and we left certain principles of finance behind a long time ago, and hey, this is how we start gaining it back.
And I haven't read about Atkins, so this is speculation, but I would imagine if they're reporting that he's worth $300 million, you know which assets are not on the public balance sheet where they could see a lot of his, as a public figure, they could see a lot of his positions. I'm going to guess that his life insurance cash value, which is an asset, is not included.
It is actually because
it's included in that. Okay.
he had to do like a full disclosure of everything he had because of
Even
being
policies.
nominated for the chairman of the SEC. So he did show it, like the couple articles I read all kind of mimicked each other. So I didn't dig extremely deep. I read like 3 articles, and it was like some of them only have 1,000 to 2,000 cash values. Some of them have millions. So he probably has a couple little baby policies that don't do much, but he has this ladder of policies. And the thing it doesn't show, because it is private and it is a contract, it shows that he owns it. It shows the cash value, the death benefits, I think, and that was about it. Like he didn't have to disclose who's insured and who's the beneficiaries, and they talked about he has multiple trusts, so obviously that's how he's going to flow money to keep it out of government hands and keep it tax free and keep that wealth transfer going. But yeah, fascinating that he 54 policies. That's like Nelson Nash level. I think he had 49, which is awesome. Yeah.
Great.
And think about, so you have 7 kids, Rob, and we're thinking generationally here. We're getting out of the mindset of every successive generation just has to figure it out from scratch, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just figure this stuff out, right? Think about how many grandkids you will likely have in 20 years, right? I mean, it's not inconceivable that you have 50 grandkids, at least if your kids are as virile as you. So like you have this huge next generation, and with just one, I mean, even just with your policy alone, you're going to be leaving these grandchildren with a level of, passed down financial education to know what to do with the large sums of money that will guarantee come to them. Likely, if these grandkids, when they're 18, 20, like starting their lives, what a perfect time to bless them with this head start. And like, the idea that we all need to just start from scratch and figure it out and learn about taxes eventually. And, we can put so many pieces into place now, and those grandkids aren't even born yet. And they're already going to be very, very blessed by what you're doing with this policy, this generational aspect of it, and thinking beyond just the next couple years and how can I make a 10% return on a mutual fund, whatever. I mean, that's when we're thinking about how this is going to pass down to the next generation. We're thinking about how we're removing it from taxation, how we're removing these dollars from the fractional reserve system, at least to the degree that our dollars go into a system that we're all going to be part of the dollar system. We're all part of the fractional reserve system. But when we move them into this vehicle, we're removing them from the taxation and the creation of more dollars so far as they remain in the policy. It's a way to just bring your personal, your family economy back into the umbrella of your control, and not just sitting somewhere else, trusting someone else whose assumptions all depend on the market going up and right forever.
Beyond that, Rob, like if you think about the heritage of this, and with you talking about the fact that we need to, in our small groups, our local communities, our families, et cetera, have this educational aspect to make sure they adhere to these constitutional principles, stand on their principles, stand on their convictions. Would that be easier or harder if you're financially secure generation to generation to stand up and lead a strong fight? Everything, all of those important things, can you be, this is why, like, we talk about the 5 F's: faith, family, fitness, finance, and friendship. Like, and friendship is community. It's not just like us, we're buddies, so we look at them in the broad sense of community. The reason we fire so hard on finance is because you can do all of those things better if you're not always in a financial struggle. If you think back to the early 1900s, somebody had to work 16 hours in the coal mines. They had no time to teach their kids the principles that they believed in, living under the Constitution, those guiding principles, their Christian principles. They just weren't present because they just had to put food on the table with everything they had. So we're creating this system where we can create a legacy of dollars, where we can actually then boost every other area of our life, and that those lessons, those remedies, that fight that we want to be a part of will be so much easier when your grandchildren don't have to worry about how they're going to put food on the table because of what you did.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I would, I would absolutely agree with that. I think for me, the issue is that never again in my progeny, my descendants, never again do I want their financial well-being to be used as a coercion tool against them.
Yep.
Now, ultimately, evil's going to have their day, and they're going to, there's plenty of things they'll be able to do to try to take faith away. So, I mean, ultimately, a relationship with the person of Jesus Christ is the only real true solution to all this. But this is a tool that if you're not using it, if you're going to go use a spoon to try to dig a hole, like, that's a problem. Like, use a shovel, use the backhoe. This is the backhoe. So we can build up better defenses. But ultimately, it's a spiritual battle. And so, the struggle will be, giving all these financial benefits to families. Then use that time, like you alluded to, like you talked about, use that time to educate them on what's truly important. And, the spiritual is what's truly important here. That's what's going to resonate. That's what's going to live on literally forever. They need to have an eternal mindset. and put the intangible above the tangible, that's the only way we're going to kind of win this, win the nation back here. Um,
Amen.
but this is definitely a tool that we can use along the way to try to make sure that the subversive, coercion tactics that were used so far, we're going to take that away from them with this. Like they're going to have to do much more drastic things to try to steal the souls of our children away.
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy our next episode coming out. As we talk about this, it'll be out this Friday, but by the time somebody hears this, ignore that comment because it'll be behind us.
If you polled every single member of the military and asked, why did you take this shot? I know very few who believed the whole story, said for my health and safety and that of my family, like, I really want to take this. I know very few people who actually bought that full thing, hook, line, and sinker. I know a lot who are apathetic and like, whatever, it's just another one. I don't care. But then I know most of the people that I've talked to did it because I can't lose this job. My wife's not working right now. We got a young kid. Brian, you were 2 months from retirement from that 20-year mark when they told you you were going to be kicked out. I got about 15 years into my 20, and, every single person, almost every single person is going to have that same thing. I just can't lose this job. Well, I wonder how different would have been if every single person had been, if their grandparents, if every member of the military's grandparents had set up this system 2 generations ago, passed this money and education down to their parents, who passed it to them so that they have this large, secure, guaranteed, accessible, warehouse of capital that is growing forever. And then when their grandparents passed and left them and paid back all the premiums essentially into the children's policies, like what we're doing, and when we fast forward, your 7 children and your X number of grandchildren won't have to, like, I'm repeating what you said, but that coercion, they're going to have this pool of capital. And it was stressful for my wife and I, and we knew we were going to figure it out, but it's like, I got 5 or 6 more years, and then we get this lifetime pension and lifetime healthcare. How are we going to get healthcare? All of those things. If I have this huge pool of cash value, that decision is a no-brainer. And how many people would have made a different decision had their grandparents implemented this? And we're doing this as future grandparents.
And I can actually tell you that on a personal level, that impacted it because I've been practicing IBC by the time the mandate came for over 3 years. So I had built up, and I had already expanded my system 3 or 4 years. So I had a pool of capital sitting there with no debt against it. I had no policy loans when that happened, and I just continued to grow that through 2020 and 2021 to see what would happen. So I remember, dude, I just spent a lot of time in my basement at our old house reading the Bible, reading the regs and stuff, like I said, praying about it. And you write about Coker versus Austin in your book. And Brandon Johnson had a second lawsuit that I was a plaintiff on, which was Crosby v. Austin. It unfortunately ended up getting dismissed after a period of time, but those kind of filed almost simultaneously. I think Coker dropped like a week or two before Crosby. And it was just like, I remember just chatting with my wife, and I'm downstairs and I was praying about it. And I walked upstairs and I was just like, I'm going on the lawsuit all in. Already know I'm not getting the shot. I'm going to throw my career if I get kicked out, lose this job, and all this stuff happens, like, we've got enough capital that we can breathe for a year or two. And if I can fly an airplane, I can drive a truck, we're going to figure it out. Like, we'll figure out how to make a living. So Hans, so what you're saying, like, actually just having a pool of accessible cash value of there helps me make my decision to jump on a lawsuit, because none of us knew what that was going to look like. Like, I remember talking to Ivan Raiklen. He helped me. He like, we sat on the phone for a while, and and he's been a champion in this fight. He's been a beast. So shout out to him. But he helped me kind of like think through how I wanted to draft my statement for the lawsuit and what I need to say. He's like, because this stuff you did is not a big deal to you, but it's a big deal to the public, who are going to read that. So he helped me write that a little bit. And I remember I said, like, do you think there will be like a target on our backs? He's like, 100%. Like, you're putting your name on a lawsuit with Lloyd Austin and Joe Biden attached, and the Secretary of the Air Force and all the other secretaries. Like, 100%. You have a target on your back, and there's going to be people following you and looking into you and digging into your past. And so that's like that's a tough thing to do. Like, you're looking at that and it's just like, man, I could just go ride into the night and not do this, or I could do this. And having cash, knowing if I lose my job, absolutely helped me take a stronger stand when I may not have done it if I was paycheck to paycheck. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm actually a living, breathing example of that. Interestingly, I had never really like tied those together, but it definitely gave me that level of security.
I definitely echo your shout out for Ivan Raiklen. There's few more powerful people to have in your corner than him right now for, fighting for constitutional rights. I'll share too, the beauty of this system is, when the government can weaponize against you, hey, you haven't followed this rule or this new law we created that's, obviously unconstitutional, but it takes a while for the Supreme Court to strike it down or whatever they're going to do, right? The government plays these games, or it, may just become the tyrannical post-apocalyptic uh, organization that, we all know it could in the future. The money's not sitting in some account that the government can freeze, that they can, take away and put it in their coffers. Like, it's all in contract that you have. If we get to the point where we have societal collapse to the level that contracts are no longer, honored or enforced in any way, like, we have a different problem. Then you're in the beans and bullets and whatever.
You were screwed no matter what you did at that
Yeah.
point.
But short of that, this system provides, a level that any other system, a level of protection, risk aversion. I'm gonna go back to risk aversion, that you can't find in any other system that's not you living out on the land somewhere with solar panels and beans and bullets not connected in any way to society, right? This is probably the best thing I could find. And I love Dave Ramsey. I love some of the principles that he lays out. But there's one thing that he's missing, and this is that one nugget, that one little apple seed that's missing in his system, where you have that level of independence from the debt system, from the Federal Reserve, and from the government being able to come in, aside from total collapse, being able to come in and control you for saying no to them, taking your money out of accounts, freezing your assets. This is something that is a risk aversion tool that does not exist anywhere else. And so that's one of the reasons, one of the most important, not the only reasons, obviously, but one of the most important reasons that I latched onto this pretty quick after learning about it from you guys.
Yeah, and something you don't see kind of like in mainstream talk about personal finance is that it's exactly, it relates to the risk aversion you're talking about. Is it's not always so important what you make. It's not always so important what rate of return you get. It's what's just as important as how much you keep.
Yeah.
And that's where the risk aversion comes in, because this replaces a savings plan where Americans are we have an abysmal savings rate. And so this gives you an opportunity to keep that money, keep it in your economy, keep it in your family, keep control of it. And just by doing that, you'll probably end up ahead of your peers who are all in on the latest mutual fund. I'm sad to say, but there's a good chance you'll be there. When you don't lose, you gain a lot.
Yeah. We topped the hour mark. We said we were going to try to not do that, and I didn't think there was much hope of that. And what do you know? Here we are. But I think that was a great talk. We're going to have Rob on more in the future. I think Rob will be, as much as he wants to come on, there's plenty to talk about. It's out of the public eye mostly. They're kind of bringing it back a little bit with the accountability discussion, the unlawful order declaration, I'll call it, the effort to bring back people who are separated, which is about 1% of the people affected. But it's a start, right? So, as the ball keeps being moved down the field, as long as it keeps progressing, there'll be more to talk about on this front. And a lot of our audience is in the fight. I'd say half of our audience at least was in the fight. And so it's still important. It's still relevant. We need to not dwell on it. I'm trying to not dwell on it, but I think that we have a lot more to talk about with, family, generational wealth, thinking like that. Like, there's just so much that we can talk about. And as you use your policy, as you grow your system, you get more of the Green brothers on board. We'll have a lot more conversations in the future. So we can end it here. And anything else you got, Rob, Brian?
I mean, I'm glad to have you on, Rob. It's been an honor, and I'm looking forward to the next book. Can't wait until that comes out, and I'm sure we'll chat again and hope to have you on again soon.
I appreciate it. I am writing in earnest and trying to, balance a lot of irons in the fire. And there's a lot more. I mean, speaking of the irons in the fire, there are a lot of things that we can delve into. We've got contacts in multiple agencies and departments throughout the government, good people that are getting into positions. We're learning a lot of new things. And so there is a lot to talk about, that tangentially connects to personal finance, that connects to, to some of our holding government accountable efforts. So I'm happy to come on and talk about any of those things in the future. But more importantly, to everybody out there listening, these guys are paving the way. Stay tuned to what they're doing. Follow them, wherever you can follow them. Brian Moody and Hans Tui. Man, I'm honored to be here with you guys, and thank you for the opportunity to come talk.
I appreciate it. All right, everyone, one more time: Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines, a story of hope for those who love liberty. You can find the link below at Rob Green 1010 on Twitter. Follow him. And for the Navy senior leadership watching, we're not going to stop. So just stay tuned in. All right. Cheers, everyone.
See ya.